We've been talking in our lesson about the proper interpretation of Genesis 1, and in particularly John Walton's functional interpretation. And last time we looked at the word bara, which is used in the Old Testament as the word for create, and I argued that bara is a species of efficient causation, not functional creation. Now we want to come to Walton's interpretation of the chapter and his claim that in Genesis chapter 1, creation does not begin at verse 1, rather creation begins at verse 2 with the primordial waters and the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. On his view, verse 1, you'll remember, is just a summary statement of the entire creation week. It is not an initial act of creation that takes place prior to verse 2. Creation proper doesn't actually begin until verse 2 with the waters already in place. So creation, he says, in Genesis 1 at least, doesn't involve bringing matter into being, but it just involves establishing functions. Now, I think it's important to remind ourselves just how radical Walton's interpretation is. We might think that on his view, creation begins with the primordial waters already in place. And then over the next 7 days, God introduces order and function into this world by making the dry land appear and separating it from the seas, bringing into being sea creatures and birds, having vegetation and fruit trees sprout from the earth, bringing land animals into being, and so forth. But as I interpret him, that would be a misunderstanding. These things would all be examples of material creation, even if they don't involve bringing something into existence out of nothing, ex nihilo, just as a carpenter's assembling a chair would be an example of material creation or efficient causation. So if this account is to be exclusively functional, as Walton claims it is, then all of the plants and the animals, even man, have to be there right from verse 2. And he simply then establishes their functions over the next 7 days. So Walton affirms on page 169 of his book that prior to the 7 days of Genesis 1, the dinosaurs and the hominids were alive and well, waiting only to be given their respective functions. Now, having said that, I've been thinking about Matt's suggestion last week that perhaps there's another way of interpreting what Walton wants to say, that he's not denying that there is material creation of these things over the 7 days, but what he's saying is that the narrative is just focused on functional creation. And that is the exclusive focus of the chapter. So we might think, for example, of an Aristotelian writer, say an Aristotelian author of Genesis 1, who does believe both in efficient creation or efficient causation as well as final causation. And we might imagine that this Aristotelian author writes an account like Genesis 1, only thinking about final causation, only focusing on the final causes, the functions that God sets up. But he doesn't mean to deny that material causation, or creation rather, is also going on. He just is ignoring it in the narrative. Now, the problem with that interpretation, I think, first is it would contradict what Walton says about what an eyewitness would have observed during those relatively recent 7 days. He says that the dinosaurs, the hominids were there, the sun was shining, everything would have appeared just the way it does now, except that God wouldn't have yet taken up residence in his cosmic temple, and man wouldn't yet have been said to be in God's image. So I don't think this is Walton's view, but still we could imagine a view like this. We could say, well, what if This is an account that is just focusing on the functions of things, and it doesn't mean to deny the material creation of these things during that time, but it's just leaving it out of account. Well, I think then the points that I've already made would still be applicable, namely that this isn't what ancient creation stories are about. Ancient creation stories are about the material creation of things. They begin with this undifferentiated state like the primordial waters, and then it describes how things came to be, how they came into existence. And in Genesis 1, you have the dry land, you have the sea creatures and the birds coming to be, you have the vegetation coming out of the earth, being brought forth from the earth, and then the animals populating the land. This isn't just specifying functions, it is talking about how these things came into existence. So to say this is only focused on functions would make the vast majority of the descriptions of what happened during that week literally false in Genesis 1. Moreover, the point that I made last week would still hold, that bara does not indicate functional creation. As we saw, when you look at the 50 or so instances of bara in the Old Testament, it's talking about efficient causation, about God producing things in being, whether these are material things or immaterial things, like a pure heart or disaster. Nevertheless, God is said to be the efficient cause. So it seems to me that the evidence supports that this account, even if it talks about functions, is nevertheless an account of how these things come to be. That is to say, God is the efficient cause and not simply the one who specifies the final causes of these things. Now, even if we agree with Walton that creation proper begins only with verse 2, I don't think there's anything in the text to suggest that this is just functional creation, that the things aren't coming into existence. But is Walton right in thinking that verse 1 is just a summary title for the chapter rather than an initial act of creation? Well, I don't think he is correct about this. And here I would simply refer you back to the lessons that we had on creation out of nothing earlier in this section. Walton does not, at least in this book, interact with the arguments that we shared in class from Klaus Westermann, which show that verse 1 is not simply a subordinate clause, but is a statement of creation out of nothing. And if Westermann is correct, then I think that Genesis 1:1 does begin the account of creation with an initial act of God's bringing the universe into being, and then the whole functional creation interpretation just collapses because it hinges on thinking that verse 1 is not the initial act of creation. Any comments or questions about this point about creation beginning at verse 2? Yes, Taewan?
Is it possible that Walton is arguing about the priority, whether it's the function that is underlying the material creation versus where material creation drives the function? Is that the priority issue?
I'm sure he would say that functions are the priority, that these things are created with a view toward this end. And I don't think we would need to disagree with that. But as I say, to just repeat myself, it seems to me that the account, though having these functions in mind, the reasons God has created them, nevertheless is about God acting as the efficient cause to bring these things into being. And that subverts then the functional interpretation.
And we all know God's word caused creation. So God's word defines the function, and the function kind of bring about material.
No, I'm not saying
No.
the function brings about these things. Think again about the difference between an efficient cause and a final cause. The final cause, the end for which something is created, the goal or purpose, that doesn't bring the thing into existence. You need an efficient cause to bring the thing into existence. So don't think that the functions or the final causes are what is responsible for bringing these things into being. Their God is clearly the efficient cause. He is the one who brings these things about.
So are you saying that between verse 1 and verse 2, God spoke water into existence except it's not recorded?
Yes.
Okay. Could it be that verse 1 is setting a limit in human understanding, since it's written for human being? In the beginning, God created, his ultimate purpose is human. And then so he kind of put a limit, and then whatever before the first day, we are not to know.
Well, I would refer you again, Tiwan, back to the previous lessons where we talked about this. And I argued there that the expression the heavens and the earth in Hebrew is an expression for the totality of everything. It means the universe. And you have this absolute beginning at which God creates, bara. He brings the universe into existence. So it seems to me that verse 1 is most plausibly taken to be an initial act of creation, which represents an absolute beginning. There wasn't anything before it. Okay, anybody else? Drew?
Just a quick comment from a paper I did on Genesis 1:1. The term heaven and earth, when it's used, like I think at least in the Pentateuch, is used for as a single referent, not as two separate referents. Heaven and earth is a single package.
Okay, good. Yes, there isn't any word in Hebrew for the universe, so this would be an idiom that would encapture the whole. All right, well, let me go on to Walton's next point in arguing for his view, which is that days 1 to 3 establish functions. Days 1 to 3 establish functions. He argues that days 1 to 3 serve to establish the basis for time measurement, weather, and food. Those three functions: time measurement, weather, and food. Now, I don't think we need to dispute that things are created for these purposes, but that obviously doesn't imply that the material creation of the dry land, the firmament, and the vegetation is not also affirmed. Walton has a particularly difficult time with the firmament which God creates. He thinks that the ancient Israelites believed that there literally existed a solid dome in the sky, the firmament, which held up the waters which are above the earth. So, he says, if we take Genesis 1 as an account of material creation, then it implies the existence of something, quote, that we are inclined to dismiss as not part of the material cosmos as we understand it. There is no firmament, in other words. He says we can, quote, escape from the problem, end quote, by interpreting the text purely functionally. It doesn't really mean that God created the firmament in the sense of bringing this thing into existence. Now here, I think, Walton has very clearly allowed modern science to intrude into his hermeneutics. The issue isn't whether the firmament is part of the material cosmos as we understand it. The issue is whether or not the firmament was part of the material cosmos as the ancient Israelites understood it. So trying to justify a functional interpretation by appealing to the non-existence of the firmament in modern science is an example of concordism, which, remember, is allowing modern science to enter into and guide your exegesis, a view that Walton himself rejects. So I find it tremendously ironic that Walton, after inveighing against concordism early in the book, should find himself guilty of this very hermeneutical fallacy himself in saying that because the firmament doesn't exist according to modern science, therefore we should think that this narrative is not about material creation but functional creation. And again, that just doesn't follow, because the ancient Israelites, if they believed it was part of the universe, wouldn't have had any trouble narrating an account of the creation of the firmament. Any comment about this point, about days 1 to 3 establishing functions? All right, let me go on then to his next point, which is that days 4 to 6 establish functionaries. That is to say, the agents who carry out these functions. Days 1 to 3 establish the functions, and then days 4 to 6 establish the functionaries. Now notice that Walton's view differs from Blocher's literary framework view. In Blocher's view, days 4 to 6 is the creation of the inhabitants of the domains created in days 1 to 3. But on Walton's view, days 1 to 3 establishes functions, and then days 4 to 6 is the establishment of the functionaries that will carry out those functions. Now, I think this is an interesting suggestion that I think is more plausible than Blocher's view. In particular, the sun and the moon do seem to be established as functionaries for time measurement. I think this is where Walton's interpretation of functional creation is its most persuasive, is with respect to the establishment of the sun and the moon to carry out the functions of time measurement, marking days and years and seasons and so forth. But of course, that doesn't do anything to rule out the material creation of the entities on days 4 to 6, as well as the establishment of these entities as functionaries. So just saying that it establishes functionaries doesn't go any distance toward showing that their material creation is not involved in those days. Any comment on that point about the role of days 4 to 6? All right, let me make one last point then before we close, and that is Walton's claim that the narrative involves divine rest in a temple, that the universe is God's cosmic temple in which he comes to reside on the seventh day. Walton argues that in the ancient Near East, gods resided in temples. That's where gods were thought to live, in the temples. And so he thinks that God's resting on the seventh day indicates that God comes to reside in the cosmos as his cosmic temple. And the 7 days leading up to this are a reflection of the 7 days of dedication that preceded the inauguration of Solomon's temple. Just as Solomon's temple had this 7-day period of dedication, so we have this 7 days of specifying functions and functionaries before God comes to reside in his temple. Well, I think the problem with this suggestion is that there's just no evidence in the text that the author thinks of the world as God's temple, or of God's resting on the seventh day as his coming to reside in the temple. Walton's interpretation, you see, presupposes that God hasn't done any creative work on days 2 to 6, and therefore he doesn't need to rest on the seventh day. He hasn't created anything, so there's no need for a Sabbath rest. And therefore he reinterprets God's rest as merely God's residing in his temple. And reinterpreting God's resting from creation as God's residing in his temple presupposes the truth of the functional interpretation. So this can't serve as evidence for the functional interpretation. That would be question begging. This view presupposes the truth of the functional interpretation. And we haven't seen any good evidence for that at all. If God is involved in creative work during days 1 to 6, then there would be a rationale for his ceasing his creative work and resting on the seventh day. And there's simply nothing about a temple here. As for the 7-day figure, I think this is much more plausibly connected with other ancient creation stories in 7 days. The 7-day motif is common in other ancient creation stories rather than trying to connect it with Solomon's temple. That is a much more distant analogy or parallel than other creation stories over 7 days. So I don't find this claim about Genesis 1 being the story of God's coming to reside in the universe as his cosmic temple to be a plausible interpretation either. Well, with that, we have come to the end of our time. So what we'll do next time is take any questions that we've had over this functional interpretation, and then we'll move to the next interpretation after that.